The New York Giants made their debut on the Hard Knocks franchise series. What did we learn from episode number 1? I have some takeaways and some thoughts from the first episode that aired Tuesday night. That's coming your way next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This episode of the Locked On Giants podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for Giants on SI. Find my written work over at si.com/NFL/Giants. And welcome on in to my Blue Crew community members, to my everydayers, to my newcomers, and everybody in between. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. It is appreciated. And if you're watching on YouTube, please consider subscribing to the channel, like the video, that helps us out, and ring the bell, the notification bell, so that you are notified every time there is a new video released. And on today's Locked On Giants podcast, it happened, ladies and gentlemen. The Giants appeared on Hard Knocks, something that John Mara, the co-owner, had said, had resisted for the longest time, but this was an off-season version of Hard Knocks, the successful franchise for HBO. And really the focus here is on the front office, building the roster, with a little bit, on the players and whatnot, but mostly on the roster building process. And there were, in the first episode, I wouldn't say there were very many surprises, maybe a little bit more context added to some storylines that we all followed throughout the preseason, the off season and whatnot. So we're going to talk about the key takeaways of this episode. And we got to start off with Saquon Barkley, because that was a huge, huge storyline. And also it was, I want to say it was one of the stories that dominated this particular episode. And oh, by the way, if you have not seen the episode yet, spoiler alerts here. So let me just put that out there. So anyway, here's the situation with Barkley. You may recall, if you're an everydayer, that a while back I kept mentioning the possibility of the Giants doing a tag and trade of Saquon Barkley. Folks, that was definitely a consideration. Joe Schoen, talked about that. In the end, he decided not to do it because they just weren't sure if they were going to be able to pull it off. All right. Because, the running back market was rich in talent. There was the draft. So at the end, they just decided, okay, you know what? We're not going to be able, to work with the franchise tag, which was upwards of $12 million for a running back. And they basically, there was a clip of Joe Schoen talking to Saquon on the phone saying, look, we're not going to franchise tag you. We're going to let you go and test the market. Now, we did not see from the trailer, we did not see the part where, hey, did we have your word? You're going to come back to us and give us a chance. We didn't see that part. That's still coming, because they kind of chop up, the storylines a little bit to get in other storylines. So basically the decision, they did contemplate, the tag and trade for Saquon. And at the end, Shane said, nope, not going to happen. And what was also interesting is in the personnel meetings, they talked about their needs. And by the time they got down to running back was at the bottom of the list. So Shane was like, look, we need a cornerback. We need a number one receiver or an edge rusher. He rattled off these needs. And he basically said, look, running back is at the bottom. So do we really want a $40 million quarterback, Daniel Jones, handing off to a $12 million running back? So that's actually something that was a recurring theme throughout. Joe Schoen talking about Daniel Jones, the $40 million a year quarterback. I'll talk about that a little later in the podcast, but that was definitely a recurring theme. So, the Giants, they went through, they mentioned some of the names that they were contemplating at free agent running back, Josh Jacobs, Zach Moss. I think Tony Pollard was also mentioned. So they mentioned some of these guys, and ultimately, Devin Singletary was the one that they went with. So, the Barkley situation, we're just now starting to get into it, to learn a little bit more about, what went into that. But ultimately, the Giants decided not to do anything with him. Now, here's what's interesting. There was something that happened in this sequence that I think is going to dispel a common belief that some Giant fans have, and that is that John Mara calls the shots. Folks, in this episode, John Mara was in Joe Shane's office, and Joe Shane was basically talking to him about Saquon and what his plan was, and how his plan was to take the money that he had, the resources that he had, and upgrade the offensive line, which, as we all know, has been a problem forever. And John Mara, very softly was like, in a perfect world, we find a way to make it happen. Now, most people would say, okay, well, if your boss says that, it's probably his way of hinting, hey, get it done. That's not what happened, obviously. So, John weighed in, gave his opinion, but at the end of the day, it was Joe Shane's decision. Okay, look, we can't afford the 12 plus million that Saquon's looking for, or that it'll cost us to bring him back on the cap. So we take that money and we go and we invest it in the offensive line, and we look to upgrade, the edge rusher and the other needs that we have that are a little bit more pressing. And I want to point something else out to you guys. If you go back to when Saquon was initially drafted, a lot of people were screaming about it. They were like, why are they drafting a running back number 2 when this roster is not complete? Well, wouldn't that have been the same mistake they had made if they had signed Saquon and said, you know what, hey, look, the roster's not complete, but hey, let's devote $12 million to Saquon Barkley, a running back, when our offensive line is garbage, when we don't have a really deep pass rush group, when we don't know who the identity of our cornerback 2 is going to be. Did it really make sense? And, this isn't a knock on Saquon Barkley. And I know some of people will say, well, they spent all the money on Daniel Jones. We'll talk about Daniel Jones coming up. But this would have been history almost repeating itself, I think. So that was kind of interesting. There's going to be more on the Saquon Barkley story, I'm sure. But we got a little bit of an insight into what was going on there. Okay. Coming up next, we'll talk about Daniel Jones, which is another big storyline, which I think they're going to track. And not just Daniel Jones's rehab process, but just the whole decision as to why he's still on this roster. All right. So don't go anywhere. We will be right back. Hey, Giant fans, I can't tell you how clutch Game Time has been for me this summer. Whether I want to see a Broadway show or a concert or another event where tickets are hard to come by, I know I never have to worry thanks to Game Time's large selection of seats at competitive prices. Want more reasons to check out Game Time? Start with event cancellation protection, upfront information about fees, seat locations at the venue, last-minute money-saving deals, and their promise that if you find tickets elsewhere in the same section and row for less, Game Time will give you 110% of the difference. So go on and get the event tickets you've been wanting. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Terms apply. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And by the way, we're interrupting the pre-recorded shows that I did with our Locked On hosts previewing the Giants 2024 opponents. And we're going to resume those tomorrow. Those were all pre-taped to kind of give me a little bit of a break from the daily grind of taping shows Monday through Friday. But we're almost done with them. I think they finish up this week. And then starting next week, all new episodes of Locked On Giants. We're going to start looking at topics to get you ready for training camp. So that's coming up on Locked On Giants. All right. In this segment, let's talk about Daniel Jones and what was revealed there. Now, obviously, you knew that they were going to show Daniel rehabbing, doing weight room work, his exercises and all the stuff on his knee. But the bigger issue here is, and again, this was a recurring theme. Joe Shane must have mentioned it at least 2 or 3 times. $40 million quarterback. So Shane, if you remember, at the start or at the end of last season, basically said, hey, Daniel Jones is our starter once he is healthy. And he never backed off of that. Now, they didn't go into whether the Giants tried to draft up for Drake May. I suspect that will be forthcoming once they do more on the draft. But really, that was the plan all along. And Shane basically said that. He said, look, the guy's got a 4-year contract. This year is guaranteed money. So they weren't going to move him, even if they had drafted a quarterback. And, so they were going to kind of stick with him. And the idea was to build up around him. And they showed a graphic where, okay, these were the skill position players that they had, Jalen Hyatt, Darius Slayton, Daniel Bellinger. I think at the time they showed Darren Waller because they didn't know if Waller was going to retire or not. The running back, they had a question mark. So the plan was to upgrade the offensive line and basically take away the last bit of excuses for Daniel Jones, because, the Daniel Jones supporters will say nobody could function with the offensive line that he had last year. And you're right. It wasn't a very good offensive line, given the injuries and the play and just everything. But basically what Shane did with this roster is he took away all the possible excuses. Now, unless injuries strike again, which we all know could happen, he took away all the excuses for Daniel Jones not to perform. All right. So that is the plan. That's what they're hoping for. And look, even Shane said it. He says, we've got to find out, is this the guy? And if he's not, we pivot and we go in a different direction next year. So that's kind of where they're at with Daniel Jones. And of course, Daniel at the time was still rehabbing. He's a little further along in his rehab now, but he did stay in New Jersey to do his rehab. And the hope is that he's going to be ready for training camp. That's his hope, as well as, the hope of the team. So what can we learn about, the Drew Lock thing? You might remember that there were reports in the preseason about the Giants having buyer's remorse, about, Drew Lock coming in to compete. And unless something was said, and just blocked out or edited by the Giants, who admittedly had final editing rights, that does not seem to be the plan based on what was aired. So, there was no hint of really buyer's remorse, although Shane did acknowledge that, the 3 significant injuries that Jones has had over the last few years, concerning. So that's kind of where they're at with the quarterback. And I'm sure there'll be a whole lot more on Daniel Jones as we get it further into the series with 4 more episodes to go. Also want to talk about in this segment, the Brian Burns trade, because that was another, big storyline. How did that come about? And there was actually a clip released before the episode aired in which, you saw Brandon Beane of the Buffalo Bills. You saw Joe Shane and Dan Morgan, the GM of the Carolina Panthers. They were standing around at the Senior Bowl and they were just shooting the breeze. And Joe Shane was kind of teasing them. Hey, Brandon, you want to move up, to number 6, kind of like throwing out scenarios and then say, nah, you don't have enough capital to move up, and then, to Dan Morgan, who Shane revealed was a good friend of his. Hey, you want to do a trade? And, they were just kind of like joking around with each other. But then suddenly Dan Morgan said, hey, you interested in Brian Burns for a couple of ones? And that caught everybody's attention. Actually, they stopped the episode to say, guess what was just introduced here? So Shane obviously wasn't going to give up a couple of number ones. And then Dan Morgan came back and he says, well, how about a 1 and a something? And Shane was like, you're getting better, so that it was still a little too rich of a trade for Shane's taste. But the point being is that's when the trade apparently first started to take shape and they started to have discussions about it. Now, I don't know exactly when it was finalized. Was it done at the combine? Was it done, later on? Maybe we'll find out in future episodes, but that was how it kind of originated. And kudos to Joe Shane on this one because look, he could have jumped at it for 2 1s. That's what the Panthers wanted the year before. I think the Rams, if I'm not mistaken, had offered 2 1s, and the Panthers turned it down. So now, because Burns was in a contract year and they didn't want to pay that contract because they wanted to rebuild their roster, now they were maybe a little bit more desperate to move Brian Burns off the team to where they were willing to settle for basically the Giants traded away assets, the same assets they got in return for Leonard Williams, which I'm sure maybe that factors into the conversation at some point. But the Giants giving up a second round pick this year, a fifth rounder next year, and the two teams also swapped orders in the fifth round this past year. So Joe Shane got himself a premier pass rusher for basically a good value. So that was a kind of a little backstory into how the trade, originated, which I found interesting. So we certainly have that to talk about. All right, coming up next, more takeaways from the first episode of Hard Knocks New York Giants offseason edition. So don't go anywhere. Hey, Giant fans, if you want to be among the first in the know on breaking news, hot plays, quotes to note, and more from Giants training camp this summer, consider joining the Locked On Giants Blue Crew community. Let's continue the conversation through one-on-one chats, exclusive video opportunities, and so much more. All of this sent directly to your phone. Try it for free for 14 days, and if you like it, do nothing and continue for just $4.99 a month. And right now, for a limited time only, you can get your first month at a 50% discount when you use the promo code BLUECREW at sign up. For more information or to register, visit joinsubtext.com/LockedOnNYGiants and be sure to enter that promo code BLUECREW at the top of the page to take advantage of our 1 month 50% discount on your first month. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and we're recapping the key takeaways from Hard Knocks New York Giants offseason edition, episode number 1. And look, if you've made it this far, you've already gotten some spoilers. But if you're just now picking this segment to tune into, there are spoilers in this episode. So if you have not seen it, I don't, and you won't hear me say this very often, but maybe you don't want to listen to this particular episode. I hope you do, but if you don't want to be spoiled, But anyway, let's talk about a few other things that were shown and weren't shown in this episode. Now, a lot of people wondered if the Giants would address the Wink Martindale fallout with Brian Daboll. The Hard Knocks and NFL Films crew did not come in until, I believe, February. And the Wink Martindale fallout happened in January. But it was mentioned in the series, in the episode. So, they did voiceovers and stuff like that, but it was mentioned because that paved the way for the introduction and the selection of Shane Bowen as the defensive coordinator. So Brian Daboll, in one scene was shown going into Joe Shane's office saying, "Hey, I'm going to offer the DC job to Shane." And then Daboll pulled out his phone. I guess he pulled up some rankings from Bowen's defense from his time in Tennessee. And he was showing Joe Shane why he was so enamored with the job that Shane Bowen could potentially do for this defense. And that, of course, ultimately led into a personnel meeting that they had, which we saw a preview clip that was first aired during the Night with Legends a couple weeks ago, that the Giants held at the theater at Madison Square Garden. So you saw Shane talking about what the base defense was going to be, what he was looking for. He did mention that he wanted 4 guys up front who could attack and penetrate to get pressure on the quarterback. And I immediately flashed back to the old 4 aces defensive alignment that Steve Spagnuolo used to run, where he had 4 pass rushers that just were designed to create havoc and cause headaches for the opposing offensive line. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I mean, not a surprise, but Bowen going into what he was looking for, he talked, the scouts were all present, and the Giants, the coaches telling the scouts what they want. And this is important because in past years with past regimes, that wasn't always the case. Towards the end of the Tom Coughlin era, there were many times, ladies and gentlemen, when the coaching staff and the front office just weren't on the same page. The front office, liked this player because he fit their mold. And maybe the coaching staff was like, well, maybe he's not quite a fit for what we want to do. So there was no cohesiveness. Now there's cohesiveness to where the GM listens to what the coach wants and then goes out and tells the scouts, okay, find them this guy. So that was, that's a significant change in how they used to do things. I think Dave Gettleman tried to do it that way as well. Obviously it wasn't that successful given how things kind of worked out, but certainly towards the end of the Tom Coughlin era, the coach and the front office weren't always on the same page, which is partially why, the Giants franchise went downhill in that regard. So, okay. What else can we take away? There were little things, like I always like to look at, the behind the scene footage, stuff that I don't get to see. So for example, I'm talking about how the facility changes. Now, as a credentialed member of the media, we are allowed into the press room, which is on one end, and on the other end of the building is the weight room and the locker room. And during the season, we're escorted from the media room through the hallway, past the lobby, past the cafeteria, down the hall, or past the weight room and into the locker room to do our media avails. We are not allowed, however, in the back, with the training area, we're not allowed upstairs unless, there's a reason for us to be upstairs, which, I can't think of any. If you get called upstairs, that's like getting called to the principal's office. So you don't want to be upstairs if you don't have to. But anyway, just little things, I was observing the signage that was on the walls, different things that have changed. There's one of their slogans is trail. And I apologize, I didn't catch what trail meant, but each letter stood for something. I'll have to look it up and see if I can find what it is and mention it next time. But even little things like how the nameplates outside the offices change. Like you think of a nameplate, you think they're horizontal, and they're actually vertical now, which, it's also was kind of interesting to see the size of the office. Joe Shane, you would think had the big corner office. And I know from having been upstairs years ago when I had a one-on-one with Ben McAdoo, the head coach usually gets the corner office, which is like the biggest office. And then the GM gets a smaller office. It's kind of a weird dynamic, but it looks like they kept up with it. So that was something that I took a look at. Obviously, the new seats, they have new seats in the auditorium that are padded with the NY logo. So just little, cosmetic changes, if you will. And I mention those because when a new coaching regime comes in, they do make tweaks to, this stuff, to how they want the rooms set up, the meeting rooms, the weight room, all that stuff. And you can kind of get a good look at how that all kind of, came together. Another thing that I caught and I found it interesting was the internal computer system or network, if you will, that all 32 teams use as far as filing trades, waiver requests, or waiver wire transactions, watching film. It was this whole big network. And if you look real quickly on the video, you'll actually be able to see what that network is. And it's a closed network, obviously, but it was kind of interesting to see how everything was kind of automated and they could call stuff up, at the snap of the finger. So that was really interesting, I thought, as far as, the little nuances and stuff that maybe nobody else would care about, but I found, of interest because I like to look at all those little things regarding how the operations go. Um, a couple of other things, just real quick. They mentioned the Senior Bowl. They mentioned the East West Shrine game. They talked about, the combine just really briefly. We'll probably see more of that going forward because this was kind of like an introductory episode. But overall, folks, the episode was interesting. There wasn't anything that made my jaw drop. There wasn't anything that I can honestly say that I didn't know. There was some more context provided into stuff that I had heard and stuff that I had reported here on this podcast as well as over on Giants Country. But overall, very intriguing series, and I can't wait to see the next episode. So next week, when they air the next episode, we will, of course, have a summary for you, the takeaways and whatnot. So that's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Giants. Tomorrow, we resume these last few opponent previews. We are off for the 4th of July, and then we're back on Friday with a new episode. So hope you will continue to tune in to the Locked On Giants podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making us your first listen of the day, or if you watch on YouTube, your first watch of the day. And don't forget to check out the written work over on si.com/NFL/Giants. Giant fans, I'll see you tomorrow with another opponent preview. Have a good one.